Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our conference, and special greetings to the Vice President and also to the former governor here, and special greetings also to those who address us from afar and join us from there. Let me start thanking you all for joining us, both virtually and in person. I would also like to extend very hearted gratitude to the distinguished speakers we've able to gather, panelists and researchers who will join us and contribute to this event. A big thanks goes, of course, also to SUERF. This joint conference is another step into long-standing, close and fruitful cooperation, which we have successfully pursued over the last 2 decades. In economics, we hear often that you like to have one-handed economists, so it's not the one on the other hand. When it comes to the eyes, I have to admit today you will see a one-eyed economist because I have a problem with the left-hand eye. So if I close this one, I still this rate. Some people in the preparation said it's good because finally a central banker focuses on the inflation objective only and doesn't look far from that. It has been almost become standard to open a conference by emphasizing that its main topic couldn't be timelier than it is. Now, let me try to convince you that these are not just empty words, but when it comes to our 49th OeNB Economic Conference and the 35th SUERF Colloquium, when we started out organizing this event more than half a year ago, we still had a question mark featuring the conference title. Back then, for many, the return of inflation seemed still a bit remote, albeit not impossible scenario. Since then, of course, inflation rates have surged in Europe and elsewhere to levels we have not seen for more than 4 decades. Accordingly to the Eurobarometer survey, inflation only represents the second most important concern of Europeans early 2022, even before the start of the war. As dutiful central bankers, of course, we have reacted forcefully and in swift manner to these dramatic developments, namely by dropping the question mark from our conference title. And I have to admit, to my task, we could have done even more. We could have put an exclamation sign there, which we didn't. But on a more serious note, the underlying questions why so few people saw inflation coming is indeed both challenging and stimulating. It guided our selection contributions to this conference. Part of the ingrained disbelief in return of inflation may be explained by the sequence of large adverse shocks and the relative absence over the last decades. And here is only a fine line between unexpected events on the one hand and missing creativity in interpreting the data on the other. Did central bankers underestimate inflation dynamics in Europe and US? And yes, why so? Should we have invested more efforts in forecasting energy prices, better understand the implications of geopolitical events for economic and inflation developments? Have our modeling efforts been too narrow when it comes to capturing large global trends and supply shortages, for example, related to green transition, perhaps even green reflation? In the very first session of this conference, Manoj Pradhan will shed new light on these questions by discussing secular drivers of inflation in the 2020s. As a nice complement, an academic session tomorrow is fully dedicated to current challenges in inflation forecasting and modeling. As Isabel Schnabel pointed out from this very bit here about 2 weeks ago, the current high inflation rates are driven to a significant extent by the interplay of global forces. Large global excess savings, high global demand, and strong integration of international values chains are part of the reasons why inflation rates have risen worldwide. However, the synchronization of inflation due to global shocks and spillovers of large idiosyncratic or regional shocks is not a new phenomenon. For this reason, I'm particularly happy that Harold James, thank you for joining us here, agreed to share his longer-term perspective on the interplay between inflation and globalization in the year's SUERF Magdalene lecture tomorrow afternoon. Yet poorly macroeconomic and econometric consideration can only deliver an incomplete picture of the multifaceted phenomenon of inflation. In fact, behavioral factors may also be to blame for our limited capacity to anticipate the return of inflation. Research based on adaptive learning models suggest that personal experience have an important influence on the formation of inflation expectations, including the individual forecast of policymakers. According to these recent findings, how individuals react to inflation surprises depends on considerable extent on the data series of inflation experience they have accumulated during their lifetime. Well, translating these results into the context of the current episode of surging prices can provide some thought-provoking insight. For example, whereas the inflation experiences of younger cohorts of policymakers would seem to be particularly dominated by the persistently low inflation, the more senior colleagues among us are more likely to remember the high and volatile inflation periods of the 1970s and 1980s. Well, according now to my calculation, the mean average of the current members of the ECB Governing Council is 58 years. In other words, the average central bank governor in the euro area may be too young to have a memory of the prelude of the Volcker shocks. So my little thought experiment yields an unambiguous policy implication. We clearly need a minimum age mandate for monetary policy committees to better foresight future inflations. Mr. Governor, ex-governor, you listen to it, I assume. Okay. In the unlikely case that you are skeptical about the unbiasedness of my scientifically grounded recommendations on this topic, I would strongly advise you to attend session 2 and tomorrow's first academic session, both on inflation expectations and perceptions. Furthermore, tomorrow's final session 4 will also teach us more about what we can use wealth of macroeconomic data out there to better grasp in real time and the past developments of the inflation process. Sometimes, of course, we need to take a step back in order to find the right words to accurately describe the way forward. In his famous memoirs, The World of Yesterday, the Austrian author Stefan Zweig painted a rosy picture of the pre-1914 Europe as a world of security. To Zweig, World War I presented a watershed moment for which the continent never recovered during his lifetime, and I would claim even afterwards, and which would shape the potential economic, social arena for years and decades to come. For Europeans, Russia's invasion to Ukraine in late February of this year will likely mark a similar turning point in history. Once again, a third unthinkable war brought the European dreams of a world of security to an abrupt end. First and foremost, this point needs to be stated outright. The war causes an unimaginable and unnecessary human sacrifice and destruction in Ukraine. From the perspective of monetary policy, this war also puts a fresh spotlight on two drivers of inflationary processes, which we have either tended to neglect in recent past, or even worse, refuse to acknowledge at all. On the one hand, the aggression against Ukraine pushed geopolitics and war back to the topic of the European policy agenda. Here, I cannot imagine a more suitable forum to discuss the economic implications of these radical changes in a post-pandemic world than our high-level panel. And I'm very proud and happy that, to welcome later Tobias Adrian, Andrew Bailey, Claudia Porio, and Joachim Nagel this afternoon. On the other hand, Russia's invasion serves also as a painful reminder of how vulnerable our dependency on fossil energy sources makes us to sudden commodity price increases and wider economic consequences. This wake-up call can serve as a unique opportunity to accelerate an anyway necessary transition to a greener modus operandi. However, forceful action against climate change can also imply trade-offs in terms of price stability. Session 4 tomorrow afternoon will therefore provide the important platform for an in-depth discussion of the opportunities and risks deriving from the impact of climate change and climate protection on inflation. Let me conclude. The last chapter of Zweig's memoirs is called The Agony of Peace. It describes the interwar period that had, in fact, managed to achieve a shaky peace, but only at the price of consistently and constantly rising political antagonism, uncertainty, and economic hardship. This gloomy outlook simply must not be our benchmark. When thinking about where to begin addressing changes ahead of us, we would be well advised to listen to those whose lives will be most affected by our decision today, the younger generation. According to the Flash Eurobarometer survey conducted in spring 2022, young Europeans speak with a clear voice. Their top priority expectations from the European Union is to guarantee the, quote, preservation of peace, the reinforcement of international security, and the promotion of international cooperation, unquote. There can be no doubt, as a monetary policymaker, that the best contribution to social peace we can make to the younger Europeans and to fulfill the expectations is to abide by our price stability mandate. I sincerely hope that this conference will pave our way back to this target and help us to better forecast and thus prevent future returns of inflation. I thank you very much for your attention. Now, I hope the technique is working. I'd like to invite Jakob de Haan of the SUERF for his welcome statement. Jakob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I hope you can all hear me and see me. Let me first apologize for not being able to come over to Vienna to be there in person with you. At the same time, I would be lying if I would say that my current situation is not very attractive, because the fact of the matter is that I'm currently in Curacao. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, this is the Caribbean part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So I'm enjoying the wonderful climate here. And in case you hear some kind of weird noises in the background, that is the sea, to which I'm very closely located at the moment. So nevertheless, I definitely wanted to be part of this event because I think it's a wonderful topic that we are discussing these 2 days. And I'm very happy that, as we did many times in the past, this event was organized in close cooperation with the Austrian National Bank. So, Robert, thank you very much for, again, this wonderful opportunity for this joint event. Let me, in addition to the words of Governor Holzmann, say a few words about the topic. And my perspective, no doubt, will be slightly different from those of the governor, because I'm an academic. And as you might know, SUERF is a platform for exchanges of views of 3 different constituencies, namely academics, like myself, people from the financial sector, and policymakers. And of course, the great advantage of being an academic is that you can speak freely without being bothered by any policy considerations. And I can tell you, because I used to be a central banker as well, I was head of research at the Dutch Central Bank. And at that time, I was more careful in what I said. Nowadays, I think I'm non-constrained. So let me share a few thoughts I have on the topic, focusing especially on the European Central Bank. As you are probably aware of, the European Central Bank is kind of lagging compared to other major central banks in the world when it comes to raising interest rates. In fact, at the moment, the ECB is even purchasing still assets under its asset purchase program. And not so long ago, the president of the European Central Bank announced that probably very soon after the termination of this APP, the Governing Council will decide to increase interest rates. Compared to steps taken by the Fed or the Bank of England, of course, it's not an exaggeration to say that the ECB is kind of lagging behind. And this has, I think, also led to quite a bit of critical comments on the ECB policies. But perhaps the situation of the ECB is slightly different than the situation of, say, the Fed or the Bank of England. And that is, I think, one of the issues that I hope will get back in the panel discussions, because one of the arguments that I think is crucial in taking policy measures is how wage and price setters react. I think that is one of the main reasons why critics of the ECB stress that the ECB should have taken bolder measures, because there's always the fear that if you don't take these measures, wages and prices will increase further. So to give this signal is important. But perhaps, the situation in this respect between the euro area and the United States may be different. Because so far, there are only pretty weak signals that in the euro area, wages are increasing fast. The most recent information suggests that, yes, finally they may pick up, but compared to the US, I think wages in Europe, at least in the euro area, are not increasing as fast as I initially expected. So perhaps in that respect, the ECB may still be on time. At least that's what I hope for. But I think this is a general issue that really needs to be discussed, because there are differences across countries if you look at the inflation and wage performance. One thing I'm still struggling with myself, for instance, is the situation in Japan. if you take a look at inflation levels in Japan and compare them to those in the euro area or the US, there's still a very, very different pattern, which to me is not clear at all why Japan is, again, so different. So I hope that this general issue of differences across countries will be taken up in the panel discussion. I think these are important differences, and they need to be carefully considered. A second issue that I really hope that our panelists will be talking about is in the way central banks model their inflation forecast. There's increasing critique on the standard new Keynesian framework to be used for inflation forecasting. And I think this is not just something that is of recent nature. If you look at the past 5-6 years, when we were still in a situation in the euro area that inflation was far below target, very often, most of the time, in fact, the ECB forecast suggested that after some time, inflation would be back on track. And of course, in all those years, that hardly, if ever, happened. So that really begs the question, are we forecasting inflation in the proper way? Is the standard new Keynesian model, which essentially failed, of course, during the global financial crisis, is that, again, perhaps not the proper framework to be used to think about future inflation? So all these issues, I think, are extremely important, not just from an academic perspective, but obviously also from a policy perspective. So that's why I'm extremely happy that this conference is taking place, and that it's also taking place, at least partially, in person again. It's been a while that SUERF colloquia were organized in person, but now I'm very happy that, again, that is possible. Let me conclude my introductory words by thanking again the Austrian National Bank for the excellent collaboration over the years and for the very strong support that SUERF has received in the course of time from the Austrian National Bank. And I really hope that we can continue our collaboration in this way also in the near future. Robert, thank you very much for your support in this. And now I hand back to you to preside over the first keynote speech. Thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much, Jakob, and I'm sure you made us all envious on your location there, which I understand, but weather's also nice here in Vienna. So we also have something to celebrate. We can immediately follow on now with the first keynote speech here, for which we're very happy that we have Pradhan here as a speaker. He is the founder of Taking Heads Macroeconomics, an independent research firm, and co-author of a book that got quite some attention in recent, well, it's almost a year now, that it was published, The Great Demographic Reversal, together with Charles Goodhart. It would be tempting for me now to end the discussion about this one, because we may not agree with everybody what you said, but we leave this for discussion in the evening, I do hope. But I would love to hear you now, and we will all love to hear you now for your speech on giving a perspective of the inflation developments in the 2020s, and we're all looking forward. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Let me start by saying thanks to Governor Holzmann, Professor de Haan, and also to our hosts for giving us a chance to talk about our views here. Let me be the first to say that I would strongly support not one but two exclamation marks in the return of inflation. I think it's a very timely topic, and I think it's going to be with us for a very long period of time. Most of the work in here comes with my joint work with Charles Goodhart. We did write the book just as the pandemic was starting. And at that point in time when we wrote the book, we weren't actually sure when the effects would show up. In fact, in the earlier chapters, if you read, we weren't clear to within 5 years or 10 years when the effects from inflation would show up. However, when the pandemic hit, we thought it accelerated many of the trends. And in the early days of the pandemic, there was a vibrant debate about whether it would be the scarring effect on the labor market or the acceleration of the shortage of labor that would show up. I think we know the answer in many places now. But let me walk you through our main thesis by arguing that there are really three inflation cycles that are playing out. There's an inflation cycle that is very closely related to COVID-related supply shortages and the excess of demand, accumulated savings, everything that was said before by Governor Holzmann. There is a cyclical story that's playing out. It's been incredible, the rate at which these shocks from energy have moved on to other prices. If you looked at the trimmed mean estimates from the Philadelphia Fed, they have gone up dramatically, which shows you that the Phillips curve that we thought was dead and buried and is still actually alive and kicking. And the third part, which I'm going to start with, is the effect of changing demography on inflation. Now, when people think about demography, they think about a period 5, 10, 20 years into the future. It's a problem for tomorrow. However, those of us who have looked at emerging markets know it's not the speed that kills you, it's the sudden stop. And what has happened with demography is being a slow-moving sudden stop. The downward pressure that demography had exerted on inflation over the last 3 decades, if it suddenly disappears, there is no longer a downward anchor that we can be confident of in the cyclical horizon. So let me start with the first bit. And I'll argue that there was a triple demographic shock over the last 3 decades, even longer, that helped inflation come down. On the left, we've got the simplest representation of globalization. Before China joined the global trading system, the working age population of the advanced economies was the blue line. Along with China's integration, and particularly when it was granted the equivalent of most favored nation status by the United States in 2000, the effective labor force became the blue plus the yellow line. That was globalization, and I'm very much looking forward to how that's going to be discussed in tomorrow's session. What we know very well is that the working age population in China in particular and the global economy has already started shifting below our feet. In fact, it was 2010. It's a very slow-moving story, and that has already started turning around. The only part of the world that holds out yet in terms of demographic numbers is Africa and India. However, their ability to transform capital and labor into output is still suspect, a point we can get to if we've got time. The second demographic shock that happened was an internal shock within China, where an absolutely gigantic relocation of labor from the rural to the urban sectors created a once-in-a-lifetime increase in China's labor supply as well. And along with that, in the background, there was a dramatic increase in the participation of women. If you looked at the sharp increase in the participation of women in the workforce, the preceding period was one in which they were very much constrained by household chores. The introduction of machines that allowed them to exert their true human capital added to GDP in 2 ways. Not only were the machines counted as part of GDP, but the effects of female participation in the formal labor force were then formally included. And all of those exerted a downward pull on wages, on prices, and an upward shock to labor supply, the likes of which we're very unlikely to see again. The intuition, however, behind that story is important. How does that demography, even if it turns, we are confident it turns, but how can it lead to inflation? Well, there are 2 clear channels through which we can think about the effect of demography on inflation. The first, as many of us will remember from trade theory, is Stoper-Samuelson, right? And that's where the tradable sector gets a shock, which then leads to depressed wages or rising wages across the entire economy. If we break the economy down into 2 segments, dependents and workers, their behavior and the impact on the economy is very, very, very different. As we know, dependents consume, the young and particularly the old, who are different because they won't join the labor force afterwards to finance their consumption. They have work, they consume, but they don't produce anymore. So their effect tends to be inflationary. If you look at workers, they're different in 2 ways. Number one, almost by definition, in every organization, maybe with the exception of a few people, the marginal product of the worker is always going to be greater than the wage that is paid to that worker. Secondly, out of the wage that they receive, they are likely to save for the future. the net impact of people working is going to be a disinflationary one, if not outright deflationary. So if you look at demography as a very simple combination of these two factors, it's not surprising that the last 30 years, which has seen a large surge of workers introduced into the global workforce, has seen disinflationary forces outweighing that of the dependents, which are inflationary. But the next 30 years are going to be very, very, very different. The delta of population dynamics is changing. And not only is the labor force going to shrink, but the percentage of the elderly in our societies is going to increase in a dramatic fashion. What the World Bank calls the oldest old, the 85 plus, are going to grow at an absolutely dramatic rate compared to any other cohort of the global population. And that's something that will start to have an inflationary influence. The second channel is the way that the elderly will tend to consume. This is a simple life cycle income and consumption model. I will argue that this understates consumption by the elderly for a point that I'll get to very soon. But what we see is in the advanced economies, consumption actually does not decline with age. It changes. I don't think we're going to too many nightclubs as we age, but we're definitely going on longer cruises. We absorb more healthcare services. We consume a different type of housing. And one very important factor is the elderly do not like to move. I mean, my father in his last few years would not leave his room for more than a few hours, with the effect that while the elderly continue to occupy their homes, new homes have to be built for generations that are starting their family life. So if you look at the total stock of housing, it's not enough for a shrinking population because of the rigid preferences and habit formation, as you mentioned, of the elderly population. What we have also seen in the pandemic, there was an uncomfortable debate, but one that everyone must have, about how we need to treat lockdowns, weighing the needs of the younger generation and the difficulties for the older generation. They are the ones who are heavily impacted. The young are not. And so there was a debate about whether we should be locking down economies instead of asking the old to separate themselves. We all know the answer. It was the right thing to do. It was the ethical thing to do. And it also told us an important economic fact, that the government is responsible when it comes to looking after its citizens. And with that in mind, if you look at any projection of debt, whether it's the Office of Budget Responsibility, whether it's the Office of, whether it's the CBO, whether it's the Advanced Economies Research in any segment, you will notice that the debt to GDP ratio in most of these economies, for age-related reasons, is going to increase significantly from here. There has been a huge amount of discussion on the amount of debt that we have accumulated during the pandemic and how we're going to finance it. But if we take a slightly longer view, the longer we look, the less difficult the pandemic situation looks, because what's coming is not going to end. The pandemic, like the wars, ended. After the wars, we saw a decline in debt to GDP, and so the concerns about sustainability of debt and how we would finance them went away. This time around, it's very difficult to deal with it. How are we going to deal with debt? Well, the best answer would be productivity. That's the answer. If you ever have any problems on an economics exam, what's the solution? You always write productivity is the right answer for every single thing. I used to give a half mark in sympathy when I was grading my papers. The difficult part is, Professor Haan mentioned Japan. Japan's output per worker, as we know, has outstripped almost every advanced economy in the world. We would be lucky to have Japan's productivity. But that is not easy to replicate. This has been the clearest period there is for CapEx and capital accumulation, but some of that is still intentional. Growth, well, economics 101 again. What we're going to get with the shrinking labor force is lower growth, which will be augmented to some extent by increasing productivity, but the combination of the two cannot be a rampant increase in the ability to finance debt. Taxation. Surely there is going to be more taxation, but even at the height of his then popularity, the one thing President Putin at that time, before the war, could not do was to push higher taxes and higher retirement ages very quickly. It's a very difficult subject. You think of a tax that you think answers all the questions that every economist answers and agrees upon, and you will find a social movement that is opposed to it that is very difficult to get rid of. Then we come to aggressive rate hikes. That's the key of the debate right now. I think we'll know the answer in a couple of years, but it's very difficult to think if you go back to the sustained increase in debt, it's very difficult to think that any inflation that may be associated with it is going to be fought off with interest rate hikes on a persistent basis. So effectively, we go back to what Milton Friedman called taxation without legislation, inflation. So a way to finance that fiscal policy has to come in through some of the changes in central bank stories. The one thing that I did want to point out is the debate that has been unambiguous, and again, something Professor de Haan talked about, is the size of the balance sheets. It's one part that we are not paying attention to structurally. It's very difficult for me as a researcher to think that the stock of debt in the economy, the issuance of debt is going to increase almost exponentially, but central banks are going to be able to whittle down the amount of bonds that they hold. The biggest seller comes to the market with an ever-expanding issuance, and the biggest buyer walks away from the market. In other terms, I think what you're going to have to look at is balance sheet expansion may become a way to become a way of monetizing debt or a way of forgiving debt over a period of time. It's a very long horizon story, and nothing like this happens without a crisis, but it is something that we have to keep our minds open to. The last bit on the structural side, what's the pushback? Well, clearly it hasn't been a book without controversy, and that's what makes it really interesting for us itself. The conversations that we'll have over here will be absolutely vital in sharpening some of it. But the first one is, well, if all of this is true, why didn't it happen in Japan? In fact, Charles and I, we spent 6 months writing the chapter on Japan first, and we told each other, if there's no chapter on Japan, there's no book. It has to happen first. Japan wasn't unique. So I've been a bit cheeky here. I took 6 charts from a chapter on debt, and I stripped off all the country names. And my point over here is just to give you a little mental exercise, but also to tell you, Japan was not different. We talked about Japan as having a large increase in debt. Its ability to do so was because domestically falling interest rates that we argued in conventional wisdom were related to demography. But a lot of the others weren't. They saw the same effects. In fact, we argue in the book that Japan was not very different. What you saw in Japan was a very similar dynamic, falling interest rates, the ability to maintain and raise debt to GDP even higher, and the sharper ones and the people who really had to look at this will know, obviously, that Japan's on the upper right. That's the only one with a debt to GDP of 250% on the red axis. But the dynamics were not different. Yes, situations were different. Idiosyncratic differences remain. In fact, what Japan saw was the massive increase in global dynamics of labor that it was seeing the opposite of at home. It recognized that demographic shock, and it invested into that shock. So the increase in outbound FDI, which is seen as an idiosyncratic regime even within Japan, was, in our opinion, an escape valve. Japanese corporates were not burdened by debt and somnolent. They understood what was coming. They saw China. They saw that increase in labor supply, and they invested heavily outside, to the extent that the overseas production ratio, the overseas investment ratio, the overseas employment ratio all increased significantly over the last 30 or 35 years. In other words, Japan understood what global demography was and took advantage of it and stayed away from home. The second one we've got are questions about savings and aging. So the most interesting of this, from my point of view, was a paper presented at Jackson Hole by Mian Straub and Sufi, which argued that inequality can lower R star even if demography and aging raise it a little bit. It's an excellent paper, and one of the most commendable things that came out of it was taking something like an amorphous concept of inequality and giving it numbers, telling us exactly how and by how much it could reduce R star. And the argument was very simple, is that inequality has gone up, And as the top 10% income share has increased, much of that has been plowed into the bond market, and that will continue to depress interest rates. In fact, just as I was leaving this morning, many of you will have seen it as well, the BIS has a new tome on inequality and hysteresis effects. I haven't gone through it, but there is a cyclical element, and how much longer it drags on will have direct relevance. However, the key issue that remains in their argument is that they see inequality as an exogenous story. From a global standpoint, we see it as an endogenous one. In the argument, in the panel itself at Jackson Hole, one of the discussants argued that the increase in the share of the top 10% in the United States was an effect of a significant underperformance of the bottom 50%. So it wasn't that the dynamics for the top 10% had changed, the dynamics for the bottom 50 had changed so much. And that stands in perfect consistency with what we argue China did. So China's manufacturing entry, China's labor force, was in direct competition with the middle manufacturing segment of the United States, not with the rich. It's the middle class that got hollowed out. If you read an excellent paper at the Federal Reserve called The Surprisingly Swift Decline of US Manufacturing Employment, it tells you on a microeconomic basis how products that were protected by tariffs were moved over to China and then re-exported back to the United States. What happened in China and global demography is perfectly consistent with an increase in US inequality. But that brings us to a very ambivalent question. The decline in R-star comes from an increase in US inequality, but a decline in global inequality. If you take those two, it's difficult to wrap your head around it. But if you look at inequality the way we do as a global phenomenon, they're entirely consistent. So that argument, I think, is far more a complement to our views and far more consistent with our views than a throwback to something different. And the last thing I would argue on that point is that most explanations of savings behavior that are based on the past do not account for neurodegenerative diseases. So Charles and I have both been parts of families that have dealt with neurodegenerative diseases. We've seen it firsthand, and we can tell you with complete confidence two things. Number one, they are incredibly labor intensive, which means anything that you see out of the UN population statistics on the availability of the workforce, you have to treat that with care because an increasing part of that available labor force is going to be shifted away to look after the elderly, which means the available labor that we have for what we would call economically productive activities is actually smaller than what UN pop stats are telling us. The second thing is the savings behavior as a result is going to change. It's going to be partly the government's responsibility and partly the individual's responsibility to end up spending more because this kind of disease, a very morbid argument, but it doesn't kill you quickly. It allows you to live for a very long time and requires a ton of empathetic care, which machines can't give you. There's a very interesting paper that came out from Japan, which looks at the effect of robotics on caring, led to no decline in employment in nursing homes at all. And so I'll come to the last point in the structural argument. Why are we worried about this? Don't central banks control the long-term rate of inflation? If they do control the long-term rate of inflation, then they would have to agree to the inflation profile that demography brings. And if they don't agree with it, they can take it back down to 2%. That may be the case in the long run. In the medium term, I'm going to argue that central banks have every reason to acquiesce to what inflation brings to us. In the last 30 years, it was easy. They were, as Mervyn King called them, the nice years. And as inflation's coming down and growth's going up, employment's going up, no one's going to complain. In the next 30, that's going to change. If the debt profile is the right one, then fighting against that means lower growth. It's not as much of a drag on employment because we have a smaller labor force, but the seigniorage revenue that will finance that debt profile has to be provided for, at least while debt is accelerating and until debt to GDP looks sustainable. And so I'll switch to my final segment over here, which is the current inflation surge and how we think it's going to be dealt with. The first thing to keep in mind is, if you remember my first three inflation cycles chart, the cyclical element is being discounted too heavily. It almost looks like if central banks hit neutral, that's it. Inflation will come straight back down, and we'll have absolutely no problem. The argument depends on the Phillips curve being dead. When the Phillips curve has been estimated over the last 30 or 35 years, any model that looks at a moving coefficient will tell you that the coefficient has become less and less predictive and comes statistically close to zero. Whether it's a reduced form model or a structural model of 3 or 4 equations, the one thing it misses is the genesis of inflation. If we do believe that China was a big supply shock that hit the global economy, then what we use in that equation on the left-hand side is inflation that is a result of US dynamics and China's dynamics or global labor dynamics. If those are done, and I'm going to skip the chart which argues that China is less of an inflationary force, I hope you'll agree with me, otherwise we can take it up in discussion. If those discussions are done, the underlying Phillips curve in the United States and in other advanced economies is probably still alive and well. Well, what about expectations? Surely those will help. There's a lot of research, and I'm really keen to see what the panel tomorrow has to say about this. But if you take a very simplistic, almost market-type look at expectations, we did a very simple exercise. We took the Michigan survey, and Charles presented this at the ECB Central Conference. If you take a look at the Michigan survey and we say, well, let's see if consumers, what they're basing their expectations on. A forward-looking 5-year moving average for the 5-year inflation expectations shows you nothing. But if you take a backward-looking 5-year inflation expectation, the story is actually crystal clear. You can do, and I did, Granger causality tests and so on and so forth, co-integration tests, they all give you the same answer, that the Michigan survey, 5-year forward-looking Michigan survey, has absolutely nothing to do with the actual 5-year ahead inflation. But it does have a lot to do with the backward 5-year inflation. So we've got a lot of challenges here that depend on us. As it turned out, we got a bit lucky, managed to do a little bit better than most forecasts, but we didn't expect Ukraine or the new lockdowns in Shanghai, and those haven't happened. And there are two broad sides of the story. The Summers and Blanchard part of the story talks about the monetary surge and fiscal spending, and it's mostly on the demand side. We're looking mostly from the supply side, depending on how quickly the labor force will come back, trying to see whether the Taylor rule and to what extent the Taylor rule is applicable. And the question about how to respond to this surge will depend on a few things. First, the disturbance is large. If the disturbance is large and we're in uncharted waters, it's very difficult to think that anchored future expectations are going to take care of everything. Expectations, wages, and prices will respond to what we are going through right now. Until we have taken control of those, future expectations are not going to get anchored again. As Professor Haan again said, a wage price spiral is beginning in the UK, not yet in the euro area, but these differences are being masked by these massive movements that we are seeing globally. So what does the medium and the long term bring us? The medium and the long term brings us a very difficult proposition. The Federal Reserve's forecasts today are arguing that a return to inflation can be accompanied by a few tenths of an increase in the unemployment rate. Charles and I aren't convinced. We believe that the unemployment rate might have to be raised quite significantly. If you look at the Atlanta Fed's wage statistics, they show you that the lowest wage and skill segments of the labor force are growing the fastest. Typically speaking, it is a recession which slows down wage growth in those particular segments. And just having a mild slowdown in the overall economy might not be enough. If that's the case and we do get stagflation, we believe that central bank independence is going to come under increasing pressure. The ECB is very lucky to have its independence protected by treaty, but not all other central banks have been there. Even before the pandemic, India's central bank has lost a fight to a large extent with the government and does not really boast of a massively independent central bank. We all saw what happened in the time President Trump was having words with the Federal Reserve, and there might be more of that to come. There's a threat of fragmentation in the EU, nothing like what we had seen before, but the fragmentation of responses and the fragmentation of impacts. Some countries are going to be affected far more adversely by gas. Others which have nuclear energy might not feel that much of an impact. Wages and the availability of certain sectors might lead to a very different way to deal from a desirable point of view of inflation. And finally, we have to keep in mind that while the chat in central bank conversations is mostly about energy, that has some elasticity. You don't have to leave your house. You can sit with the windows open if you want. But food inflation derails governments. There's been a change of government in Sri Lanka. There's been a change of government in Australia. Every incumbent government is under pressure when it comes to food because no one can not eat. Very recently, we've come to start getting to terms with the blockade of Ukrainian grain. The recent heat wave, which I feel like I'm almost under right now, in India has stopped exports of grain over there just a few weeks after Prime Minister Modi had promised that we would feed the world. And it hasn't really happened. World Bank report argues that food prices are going to rise into 2024. Even if that's half right, we're in for a turbulent future. The long-term demography is going to be the story, we believe, that settles the future of inflation. Yes, geopolitics are adverse for now, but it's incredibly complicated. It's very difficult to say which way they will evolve. There might be a lasting peace that comes out of something as horrible that's happening in our economies, but demography is largely predictable. And to ignore that because it's going to happen 20 years from now seems to be a very difficult proposition. I'll stop here and hand it back to you, Governor.
Thank you very much, Manoj, for this fantastic short version of your book and the many things you put on the table. I assume we could spend the rest of our conference today and tomorrow simply discussing each of the topics through. But I assume some of the topics you raised will emerge there. For the time being, we have a few minutes left to answer one or two or three questions. What it is, I suggest that we bring a couple of questions together. We already see one hand up there. Sorry, sorry, David, I missed you behind the curve.
Well, thank you, Manoj. My question is about the euro area. You say quite rightly that extension of central bank balance sheets is going to become very much the norm, and this will mean monetary financing. That's okay if you're Japan or the United States or the Bank of England, but it's strictly against the rules in the euro area. So what's going to happen there?
David, thanks.
Just bring things together, otherwise we won't be able to do it. Okay, second. And the third hand up, just to... Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Suzanne Bishop-Prick from Global Sovereign Advisors. My question is actually from my mother, who is 95, and she says that her age group has been disproportionately affected by deaths from COVID. Is it possible that the epidemic has had some beneficial impact on reducing the dependency ratio in countries like the United States and Brazil, where my family live?
Interesting question, okay. Over there, please. Yes, thank you.
My question is, you mentioned wage price spirals as a danger. Isn't it now more a problem of a profit price spiral? Because even producers which produce electricity, which do not use gas but have electricity from water power or atomic energy, they increase the prices. And there is one success story in Europe, France, which curbed with price increases, and they have the lowest, or one of the lowest inflation rates in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Three questions, please.
David, first, pleasure to see you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
excellent. So I think it's a matter of whether the rest of our story works out the way we think it does. As I said, a lot of the policies that we've seen over here didn't look like they would materialize in our lifetimes. When we looked at quantitative easing, that had been done as an experiment in Japan, and yet when the global financial crisis came, not one, not two, but 10 central banks picked that up very quickly. In the last episode, which we saw in 2020, emerging markets started doing quantitative easing. I mean, you know, I remember the day that South Africa announced that it would buy bonds in the secondary market, the rand moved 0.001%. That's astounding. Any time in the past that an emerging market central bank had argued that we're going to buy government bonds, Indonesia buys it in the primary market, not even in the secondary. Poland, India, they've all bought these bonds. It would have been thought of impossible because of moral hazard. So come the crisis, I think the extent to which we will be willing to go will change. And it depends on leadership from one or two of the key central banks. The European Central Bank may not be allowed to go in given the current conditions. They may get allowed later on if everyone else is doing it and the European Central Bank looks like it's not. But I don't think this is something that will be a first go-to decision. I think if it turns out to be the right solution, it'll be the solution we hit after all the other options have been exhausted. That's typically how we get to this point. My simplistic argument would be that what central banks have to do in order to create debt forgiveness is not to forgive debt, because that would create chaos in financial markets, but to turn them into variable coupon consols. You turn them into bonds that never really mature, and that's the way that you can get seigniorage revenues, even if you don't have inflation surprises. I think that's the thinking behind it. To your question on aging, it's a very difficult one to answer from all points of view, having personally gone through some of these things myself. But if you look purely at the numbers, there's a scale and an incidence of mortality rates. The mortality rates obviously have been the highest where people have been the most vulnerable, and they have come gradually lower. So if you look at some of the numbers, yes, they have created some demographic room, if you will, but I would point you in the other direction also where there's been a baby bust, which means we've kind of heard both tales of the demographic distribution. If it was just the one part, and we could say that, look, a lot of these stories are going to ease up in the future, we don't really have the same overhang that we did, that's not true. The second thing that has changed is we have become far more localized. We're not globalized anymore. If you look at Australia and New Zealand, for example, their participation rates are through the roof because foreign workers aren't coming in. If you look at the United States, on the other hand, their participation rates have lagged because foreign workers aren't coming in. So there are very different effects going on across economies. I would only point out that the amount of people that we will need to look after the elderly over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years will dwarf the debate on whether machines are killing jobs in the economy. In fact, we need machines to destroy as many repetitive tasks because there'll be enough jobs looking for the elderly. So I think it's both parts of the distribution that have really been affected. And your question on energy, it's well taken. I think there are economies that have a little bit more room in some areas to deal with it. For example, if I'm not mistaken, France has nearly 80% of its energy coming from nuclear sources. I may be wrong in that statistic, but it's very high. Sweden was another economy that thought it wouldn't have the inflationary pressures because about 70% of its energy is green already. And they've had huge success in the past dealing with it. But I think the overall issue is an economy or two, I think you can generally deal with, but an economy the size of the euro area, with the amount of interactions you have across, with your status in the global economy, it's impossible to think that one economy that size, of that importance, can go unscathed.
Thank you much. I'm afraid we have to finish now to move on to the next stage. But since you're here, I would still like a comment to make here. My sense is in your presentation of aging, you somewhat exaggerated it by using a fixed age concept, what aging means. If you take account that people get older, the remaining life expectancy has increased tremendously. So the 70s, the old 50 or so. So I think you make a point. I think you have a point, but I think the way it is currently presented, it exaggerates what aging means.
It's an excellent point, and in fact, we've got two parts of the story in the book on the chapter on where we could be wrong. There are 3 chapters, in fact, we've dedicated to saying where we could be wrong. We come out on the right side of our own arguments, thankfully.
That's good.
One side argues that over the last 20 years, participation rates of the over 65 have gone up considerably and consistently. The second side
is a very simple chart that shows you the spread between life expectancy and retirement age. It's gone up in a straight line. Because while life expectancy has gone up 15, 20 years, the age of retirement has gone up 2 or 3. It's an incredibly difficult process to get that. And the gap between the two is where a lot of that debt comes from. So while I completely agree with your point that we should have been more dynamic or could be more dynamic, I think the gap between the two still allows the debt profile, which is critical to our argument, to remain in place.
No, excellent point, and I assume if you found the solution, you will call up Mr. Macron to give him the answer.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Hope to see you around. Thank you. Thank you. And now I call Mr. Knan, Nestor, to chair the next session.